So this week we're looking at the early years of the Cold War. And first off, the Cold War refers to this period of about 4.5 decades where we basically had this standoff and this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And what it really was a competition between competing ideologies. The United States represented democracy and capitalism. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, they represented communism and the command economies that came with that. And so it was 4 decades of tension between these two nations and competition to see who could have the greater influence around the globe and build up the biggest militaries. And so it started almost immediately after World War II, and it's going to continue all the way into the early 1990s. When we look at the origins of the Cold War, first off, the Cold War started immediately after World War II. And even in the last years of World War II, there was tensions developing between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wasn't happy with the United States and Britain that it took them so long to open up a second front against Germany. They were also upset with the United States that they had kept their nuclear program a secret from the Soviet Union, who was supposed to be their allies in the war. And so there was already tensions during the war itself. And after the war, almost immediately, they started competing for influence. And it started in Europe. And so what was agreed after World War II was basically the countries that had been liberated by the Soviet Union would kind of stay under their influence, and that included most of Eastern Europe. And the nations that had been kind of liberated by the United States and Britain, well, they would kind of stay under their influence. And so what this led to was basically a Europe that was divided almost in half. And Winston Churchill described it as this iron curtain that divided Europe. And everything east of that iron curtain was communist and allied with the Soviet Union, and everything west of that iron curtain was associated with the United States and capitalism and democracy. The Truman Doctrine established the U.S. policy of containment after World War II. And technically what the Truman Doctrine did was it pumped money into the economies of Greece and Turkey to help prop them up after the war and keep them from falling. But on a larger scale, it established this idea that the United States would work to contain the spread of communism and protect free peoples that were threatened by communism. The Marshall Plan pumped tons of money into Western Europe after World War II. All of Europe, and many other parts of the globe for that matter, were struggling after World War II. And the United States didn't want these Western European economies collapsing and possibly turning to communism. And so they pumped over $12 billion into Western Europe. And overall, the Marshall Plan was extremely successful. Within a few years, Western Europe was producing at levels they had been before World War II. And then one of the final things that really cements the Cold War was the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The United States is going to create NATO, which was an alliance that included the United States and Canada and most of Western Europe. And this was a military alliance. So an attack on any of those nations was seen as an attack on all. And the Soviet Union is going to counter with the creation of the Warsaw Pact, which again was a military alliance between the Eastern communist economies in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And so that kind of solidified this division of Europe and really cemented in this idea of the Cold War. Now, we call it a Cold War because luckily it never came to direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union. There would be conflicts, but no direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, what we had was 4 decades of tension where at any moment the two could be at odds with each other. So when we look at the Cold War in Europe, again, with the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, it created this division in Europe. And even Germany would be divided between an East and a West. Since the eastern half of Germany had been liberated by the Soviet Union, it stayed under Soviet influence. And Western Germany had been liberated by Britain, France, and the United States. So at first it was divided into 3 separate territories, and they would unify it into Western Germany, and it was a capitalist democratic nation. The capital of Berlin was also divided in half. And this is going to lead to problems because Berlin was right in the middle of East Germany. And so what you had was West Berlin became kind of this island of capitalism surrounded by communist East Germany. And at first, it worked out okay. However, the Soviet Union decided they were going to try to force West Berlin to become unified again under their communist government. And so they decided to set up a blockade around Berlin where they cut off transportation in and out of West Berlin. And their plan was basically to starve out West Berlin until they gave in and agreed to join back with the East. So in what's known as the Berlin Airlift, the United States and Britain flew these round-the-clock missions into West Berlin. They had a plane landing every few minutes with supplies for West Berlin. And they kept this up round the clock, 24 hours a day for over a year. And finally, the Soviets backed down and give up and end the blockade, and Berlin would remain divided. Well, over time, many people were fleeing East Berlin for West Berlin. And within a short amount of time, within a few years, there became this stark contrast between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Western Europe was doing well, their economy was doing good, and they had access to all these consumer goods that were not available in the East. And so many people were leaving East Berlin for West Berlin. And it looked really bad for communism, and it looked bad for the Soviet Union. And so they decided to build the Berlin Wall to prevent people from fleeing the East to the West. Another big part of the Cold War was this nuclear arms race. And both sides, both the United States and the Soviet Union, began to amass these huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And by the early 1970s, they had both achieved what we call MAD, this mutually assured destruction. That basically, if a war ever did break out between the US and the Soviet Union, both sides would lose. With the number of nukes that each side had, they would completely annihilate each other. And so that was a big part of the Cold War, though, was this arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union.